But I'd like to start not in the Middle Ages, but in the Victorian period. Now, the Victorian age seems full of protean figures endowed with boundless energy. One such man was Frederick Furnivall, who was born in 1825 and died in 1910, and whose immense enthusiasm for medieval literature profoundly shaped our modern understanding of Chaucer. As a young man at Cambridge, Furnivall's chief passion had been rowing, but a friendship with the son of a local bookseller encouraged his interest in literature. Furnivall was captivated by his first reading of Tennyson's Morte d'Arthur and became deeply interested in older literature. At the age of 22, Furnivall joins the Philological Society and became its honorary secretary, a position he held for the rest of his life. And in this capacity, Furnivall did much of the groundwork in establishing the Oxford English Dictionary, and many distinctive features of the dictionary's organisation, such as the way in which members of the public were encouraged to contribute, were Furnivall's idea. Furnivall's involvement with the dictionary made him aware of the large numbers of early English texts which had never been printed, and he established many societies designed to make these texts more available. Of these, the most famous and influential was the Early English Text Society, which became the chief vehicle for the publication and dissemination of works by authors such as Chaucer, Gower, Lydgate and Hoccleve. Among the societies created by Furnivall were also the Chaucer Society, the Ballad Society, the Wycliffe Society and the New Shakespeare Society. So he's a real club man, but these were really geared to getting medieval literature into the public domain. And through his work in creating these societies, and through the many editions he produced himself, most notably a sixth text version of the Canterbury Tales, Furnivall helped create our modern view not only of Chaucer, but also of much Middle English literature. Well, Furnivall was a colourful character with a zest for life. He founded a rowing club for young women at Hammersmith, which, in the words of one of his biographers, brought together two of his favourite activities, vigorous outdoor exercise and the company of young women. Furnivall's editorial activities were marked by a breezy and cavalier approach. He wanted to get unknown literature out to the public and didn't bother too much as to whether he used the best manuscripts or got the dating right. This frequently led to disputes among the members of his various societies, but Furnivall's energy made up for his other shortcomings, as can be seen by his great campaign to publish the life records of Geoffrey Chaucer. At that time, very few of the National Archives had been printed. For example, the Chancery rolls containing copies of letters and diplomas issued in the name of Richard II were not published and hadn't been systematically examined by historians and literary scholars. Furnivall realised that these records contained a great deal of information about the life of Chaucer and urged scholars systematically to collect these references. Furnivall enthusiastically led the charge and from 1863 regularly published information about Chaucer's life in the columns of the Athenaeum magazine. This resulted in the publication of a series of volumes of Chaucer life records, which provided an outline of the poet's life. As the public records continued to be systematically catalogued and published after Furnivall's death, further references to Chaucer were discovered. The American Chaucer scholars John Manley and Edith Rickert has resumed a systematic search and hired the British record agent Lillian Redstone, who's shown here with one of the patent rolls of Edward III, who uncovered a lot of further material about Chaucer. And all this activity helped to pave the way for the publication in 1966 of a new consolidated edition of Chaucer life records edited by Martin Crowe and Claire Olson. We frequently assume that information about the lives of medieval people is sparse or fragmentary. The Chaucer life records are a startling reminder of how extensive and detailed our medieval archives are, and show what a large quantity of information can be assembled about the life of one person in the late 14th century, if only you can find time to comb through all the miles of vellum in the archives. Although Chaucer was a successful member of the royal household and an aspiring bureaucrat and gentleman, he wasn't a particularly prominent figure. But if you look at this 1966 volume I mentioned before, the Chaucer Life Records, you could see there's a pretty sizable dossier that can be built up about his life. There's quite a substantial piece of information about one middling member of the royal household and a civil servant. Chaucer's probably the only non-aristocrat from the 14th century for whose life we have so much information readily available. But the size of his life records illustrate how it would be possible to recover the life story of many other people of comparable social status to Chaucer from that time in a similar degree of detail. What's been done for Chaucer could have been done for hundreds of others. It's just because it's Chaucer, people have gone to the trouble of doing it. Moreover, there are many series of records which haven't yet been systematically examined for information about Chaucer, such as these files here, which are files of evidence from the central court of the King's Bench, which were only removed from their medieval sacks in which they'd been stored in the 1970s. They just lay there for 500-600 years and have never been systematically examined by scholars. And we know from the fact that these records exist that there are certainly many other further life records of Chaucer to be discovered. The process of recovering and revealing Chaucer's life contained shocks and surprises for Furnivall and the others who have traced records referring to Chaucer. One of the most controversial discoveries was announced by Furnivall in the Athenaeum in November 1873. Furnivall reported that William Floyd had found a copy of a deed dated 1st of May 1380 by Cecily Champagne, daughter of the late William Champagne and Agnes his wife, by which Cecily released to Geoffrey Chaucer all rights of action against him for his rape of her. The exact term is de raptu meo. This document had been formally enrolled on the Close Roll, one of the two great rolls kept by the Chancery, which recorded royal correspondence. On the face of it, here was an accusation that Chaucer had committed rape, a claim which cut right across the image Furnivall and others had been building up of Chaucer as a detached, ironical, gently satirical humorist with a wry and sympathetic personality appropriate to the man they claimed as England's second greatest poet. Furnivall immediately tried to suggest that matters were not as serious as they seemed at first sight. He pointed out that this deed may merely have set at rest an unfounded claim, may have just been tying up some odd loose business, he suggested. He felt this was more than likely because he said it just didn't make sense to formally record and witness in a royal archive document something that suggested that Chaucer was guilty of a felony. So Furnivall was really quite disturbed by this finding, and he admitted privately that this accusation looked bad for Chaucer, and he threw himself into a frantic search for more information about the case. In the Athenaeum for December 1873, Furnivall reported that he had searched through all the records of the Central Court of King's Bench for any trace of an action against Chaucer by Cecily Champagne, but he hadn't been able to find anything. Moreover, he pointed out that while the word rape was used in the 14th century for sexual attacks, it was also at that time used for cases of abduction. He described a case in which John Head, a clerk, was accused of rape because he had abducted Catherine, wife of Robert Spring, and seized her together with various goods and chattels. The idea that the Champagne case referred to an abduction rather than forced sex was an attractive explanation to Furnivall, and he suggested that Chaucer may have carried off the young lady in order that she could marry one of his friends. There's no basis for such a claim, but it fitted the picture that Furnivall had built up of Chaucer much better.